Hey everybody, and welcome back to another Rive tutorial. Today we are going to be tackling a cool sci-fi holographic button. I wanted to make a tutorial on this one because I love sci-fi, first off, and second, using Rive's vector feathering techniques, there's a really great way of doing this that essentially fixes a lot of problems of the traditional approach to this method, where you'd be duplicating layers to create a holographic effect, but then you're actually, especially in code, you're dealing with multiple layers that you have to keep updated, and it becomes kind of a pain and overwhelming, and usually not worth it. Plus the added rendering, you would just, eventually it just becomes not worth it. Um, so this is a great little technique I've come across just doing some work on my own here, and I wanted to share it with you guys. So you can run with it, have fun with it, and I'll post it on the community. So I'll give you access to this, and yeah, let's get started. I'm going to show you the finished version first, and then we're going to hop in and recreate it. Okay, so the finished version simply looks like this. It's going to have an onload event, so it loads in and it kind of pops out like that. And then when we press it, it's just going to create this nice little glowy effect here. Pretty simple, straightforward. Okay, so let's dive in. How do we make this? Let's start by creating a new artboard. And I've already added the image asset here just in preparation. So first thing we're going to do, we're going to just change the artboard background, make that black. And we're going to throw in our background asset and center that. And then we'll just make that like 10%, 15%, 15%. Let's just try that for now. Okay, now we're just going to create our button. So first thing we're going to do is just draw a rectangle. Now, of course, you could use the layout tools here if you wanted to. That's totally up to you. We're going to just make this 250 by 64, which is a good size when you're pressing a button. And then we're going to add our colors. So I'm just going to reference the one I've already made. Obviously, all the colors are going to be in this version that I'm going to upload to the community. And there's only a few colors. I think there's actually only 2 colors, and then we're just modifying blend modes, opacity, and the feathering, and that's about it. So we've got a base color here. So let's start by just adding that to this rectangle. And we'll just set the opacity of this to, I don't know, 25. Okay. And then we're going to do the text. So press T to use the text tool. For this tutorial, I'm going to use the font Chakapetch, just because it's a cool, oops, I want to do that here, just because it's a cool sci-fi-ish font, and it's, it's a Google font, so it's readily available. We're going to make it, let's do it medium, and we'll do 24 pixels, and let's change the text to holographic. We'll center this and maybe add, sure, a 2-letter spacing to it. Okay, so now we've got those. Let's add the rest of our colors here. So we've got on our text layer, we're using this bright color. And actually, I believe the base of it, yeah, so that's our base as well. So we're going to go back over here, select our text, and we're just going to use this as the main color here. It's going to change a little bit when we add our feathering effects. So we can do that. We can do that next, actually, because we've got our base color now, this one here, even though it's got some transparency in it, and then we've got our bright color here, so we can reference those as we go. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create the feathered holographic effect for the button itself. this works in two ways. So we've got our rectangle that we've built, and then we've got our text. And each of them are going to have the same feathering and animation effects in order for this to work. And obviously you can stagger this and do whatever you want when it comes to the animation in your own files. But for an example, I think this is a good approach. So first thing we're going to do is just add the holographic effect to this background rectangle. And to do that, all we're going to do is add another fill. We're going to bring it down to the bottom because this is, see, that's probably a bug, but I've noticed this here and in the layers panel. It's really hard to move things underneath stuff. Sometimes you just have to move the bottom thing on top, which is a little easier. So we're going to grab the color here. We're going to change this from, because you can see it's a linear gradient right now. We want to change that to solid. Just going to throw in that color. We'll change it to 10%. And then we're going to add our feathering. So if you can either click on add feather, or you can go to the settings here and click on the feather there. Yep, we know that. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to offset it. So we can do, let's say, maybe like 8, and then maybe 6 with an amount of, let's try 1 for now, and then let's increase the opacity a bit so we can make sure we see it. Okay, I'm okay with that. Now, here's a note. In order for this to work well, you got to remember how lighting and this holographic effect would work and be manipulated in real life. In this instance, essentially how you're thinking of it is, let's actually, before we do that, I'll just group this so it's easier to move around. So we'll do that and we'll call it button group. So essentially, if this was a real hologram, this button would be way up here. I would be looking at the center of my screen as the center of my screen, but the button itself is actually top left. And that's why we're getting this holographic effect that shows the way it's showing now. This effect wouldn't make sense if you moved it over here, depending, of course, on your layout and how you're projecting this on your screen. And of course, this is all subjective. You can do whatever you want. But if I was going to be doing it in the top right like this, I would actually change my approach. So instead of offsetting it to the right, I would actually modify this so it's -8. So it feels like the center of the screen is the center of the screen, and then everything else projects in that direction. Something to just keep in mind, depending on your project, of course. But in this example, we're just going to make it simple, because theoretically, if it was based on my description just now, if it was in the center of the screen, you actually really wouldn't see a holographic effect, because maybe scaling, you'd see a little scaling coming out from the middle, but for this tutorial, we're just going to do coming out from this direction. That's just something to keep in mind depending on your project. So we've added the feathering effect now to the button. Let's do the same to the text. We're actually going to do a few things to this text to make it look cool. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a couple fills. So let's do this one and then another one, move them both to the bottom. So this one here, this top one that we have right now, is kind of like our base fill. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take that darker color, so the one we were using in our button here, go back to our text, and then we're going to throw this in here. Now, this is actually just going to be a blur. So we're going to go to settings, and we're going to feather it, and we're going to change this to like, maybe like 1.5, 2. 2's good. So really all we're doing here is just adding a little bit of a feather to that text. Okay. Now, the next part is we are going to do the same thing essentially that we did with our button previously. So we're going to grab this top color just to make it a little bit more visible. And we're going to change the bottom fill to the main text fill that we're using. And then we're going to feather it the same way we feathered the button. So let's do maybe like 1, and then I think it was 8 over and 6 down. Okay, maybe do 1.5 on that, and then we're going to change the opacity to like 15%. Nah, maybe a little more. 25. Let's try 20. Okay. Okay, so I'm good with that. Happy with that. There's one more fill we're going to add on the text, and this is just to make it pop a little bit. So we're going to add one more fill. This one is going to be utilizing the same color as our default. We're going to feather this one with, let's just start with 1. But this time we're going to change the blend mode. We're going to actually change this to overlay. And it just gives it a little bit of a pop. Now, or should I be using this darker color? No. Let's just double check to make sure I've set this up the same way as I set this one up. Yep. 0.5, 2, and 1. So we'll change this to 0.5. And then 2, and I like 1.5. We'll leave it like that. Okay. Now we've got the start of our holographic button. Very simple. Okay, I'm just going to lock the background just so I don't accidentally click it. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to start animating. So the first step of this is we're going to create our onload timeline. So let's go down here and rename this to onload. And this one is very simple. So when I'm doing this, I like to create my keyframes in the start and the finish position. It helps me remember where these things are supposed to be when they end up somewhere, instead of right now, if I was to add my X and Y positions and then keyframe and then move it. So in this case, I would move it. It would be 8 over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 6 down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But then when you, depending on obviously your project, but then when you start keyframing your end animations, you may or may not forget that starting position you wanted to end up in. So I just usually like to keyframe the start and the end, and then start making modifications. Obviously won't do it here, but 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. So we'll just do 20 frames, and then I like to change the interpolation, especially with the sci-fi stuff. Obviously, linear interpolation doesn't work well. That doesn't look good at all. If we modify it so it's cubic, it looks a little better, definitely. But with the sci-fi stuff, I like to amp it up even a little bit more than this. So what I'll do is I'll drag this, hold shift, so it goes over straight. And then I like to just line up the 2 dots. So it goes faster in the start and then slows down near the end. And then, you can even go like this and make sure it's directly over. And then set it as your default interpolation, so you don't have to keep doing it. Right? So that pops in like that. Now, how do you make it look holographic? Right? Because this isn't the effect we want. It doesn't look like it's popping out of anything. So this is the great thing about Rive. So let's move myself back down. Now let's work on our positioning. So all we have to do for this effect is go to the start of our work area, our timeline here. And we're going to go to we're going to have to do this for both the text and the button itself. So let's go to our rectangle, and then let's go to our feathered layer. So this bottom one, and remember we set it to 8 and 6, but all we have to do, we're going to keyframe those, and we're going to keyframe the end, so we don't have to remember. We're going to go back to the beginning, and here's the magic. Just set this to 0 and to 0. Because now essentially all it's doing is it's starting in the center of this button, and then as we progress over, the position of the rectangle is moving 8 over and 6 up. And the feathering is actually moving 8 over and 6 down. And what's happening then is it's creating this effect, like this illusion that it's actually popping out of the screen. But in theory, you're actually, the only thing that's happening is you're adjusting the feathering position and then the position of the button itself. Right? Pretty straightforward. So all we have to do is do the same thing for the button, for the text, and we'll be on our way. So let's just go to the text, and it was the bottom layer here, so we're going to do exactly the same thing. We're going to go ahead and keyframe these, and at the end, and change it at the beginning to 0, 0. So now it looks like it pops off the page. Okay, simple. And that's just our onload event. So the last thing we're going to want to do for this, I mean, you could keep it like this if you wanted, for it to load like that, or you could just have a fade in. So if we just add, you know, just go like this, and then want it to be full there, and then we could just go like this, right? You could do it that way, or you could just leave it the other way. That doesn't really matter. Okay, so now let's work on our press effect. So what we're going to do is we're actually just going to duplicate the onload timeline because a lot of the work's already been done. So just right click on that, click duplicate, and then we're going to change the name of this animation to onPress. Okay, but obviously on press, it's already appeared, so we want to remove the opacity stuff that we set. Okay, great, and essentially, here is a nice little trick. So this effect is the same one we want when you press it in. So you could do this multiple ways. You could do it so you start this timeline with the defaults that you've set on the artboard. So like if I get rid of everything, it's going to be this. And then we could go keyframe out, you know, I don't know, 20 frames worth of you pressing that in. That's totally fine. You could do it that way. You could do it with, you could do it so you're pressing in and out in the same timeline. So maybe like 20 frames of the press in animation and then 20 more frames of the press out animation. And then every time you're pressing that, it's just doing the whole loop. You could do it that way too. Depending on the complexity of the animations, I like to try to just reuse as much as I possibly can. So this animation is a little different because we're not using the opacity. But we're still using this up and down effect. So what we're going to do is I'm going to make it a little shorter. So we're going to go to 15 frames, and then we're going to select all of our keyframes, right click, and set work area. Thanks to whoever the community member was that mentioned that, because it saved me loads of time. Okay, so now we have our on press animation, right? But here's the thing. It's actually going to play in reverse first, and then it's going to play again forwards in order to achieve this press effect. So to do that, we've got our onload layer here. We're going to rename this layer onload because this is always just going to load like this. Okay. And then we're going to create a new layer and we're going to call it onPress. Now, what we need to do is we need to create our listeners and inputs in order for us to know that the button's been pressed, and our input acts as our trigger. And then we can set up our timelines. So what does this look like? Let's move myself again. First thing we're going to do is set up a listener on the rectangle. You can do it on the whole button group, actually. Why not do that? So let's set up a listener. We're going to target our button group, and we're going to change it to click. Now, we don't have an input yet, so we can't really do anything with this. Let's fix that. On our inputs, let's add a trigger input and call it press. Let's call our listener press listener. All right, so now when we press the button group, so when we click our button group, we're gonna run the press trigger. So now if I play the state machine and I press anywhere on this button, you should see this trigger run. So let's turn it off and on. Okay, so that's not working. Click, fire, press. That should be working. Let's try doing this and just setting the rectangle instead. That's also not working. That should be working. And it's set up exactly the same way as my other artboard. This should work. Let's just go out of animate mode, back in, press listener. When we click our button group, we're firing the press input. That is correct. But it doesn't want to work. That's very strange. Let's double check again to see what could possibly be going wrong here. We're pressing on the button, click, we're firing press. Let's play this one. Okay, maybe it's just that the trigger's not showing it's functioning, but it is actually functioning. So I thought that there was a visual feedback and this would appear like this when it was triggered, but maybe I'm wrong. Let me know in the comments if that's the case, because this, like I said, this listener should work fine. Okay, so we've set up our listener, we've set up everything. Let's get this set up now. So we've got our on press timeline. Let's drop it there. And now because we've set up our listener and our input, we can run this timeline on a conditional. So we're going to change it so it's on any state, and it's going to be on press. And for now, let's just exit this to make sure it functions. So let's just see here. Okay, so it looks like it is triggering. And if we change the duration here to 100%, it should trigger. Let's then set our condition here. So the condition going up here is, of course, our press. So when our trigger is pressed, play the on press timeline and then exit. Okay, and it looks like that works. But here's the fun part. We're actually going to play this in reverse. So to play this in reverse, select the timeline, in the state machine and change the speed to -1. Now when we press it, you can see it goes down, playing backwards. Then what we need to do is we need to add it again. And we're going to connect these. So we're playing this at -1 speed. We're going to change the exit time here to 100% to make sure that this time, all of this timeline plays. So like the on press animation plays in reverse first, and then it's going to play it the right way around, and then it's going to exit. We need to also make sure that our duration here is set for 100% so this whole thing plays. So let's test it. Press it in and press it up. Perfect. Now we've accomplished this whole animation with just using the individual timeline. Like I said, there's many ways of doing this. Depending on your use case, obviously choose what's best for you. This method is a little bit more complex, but I like it for things like these buttons because it just keeps a little less complexity out of the animations themselves, and you're defining more of what happens within the state machine. I like that. Okay, so now our button works, and you can see it goes back in and then comes back out, pops back out. The last thing I like to add to these is like a little bit more feedback, a little bit more visual fluff. So when I press it, obviously, you know, like it goes in and out, you can tell you're pressing a button. But let's make it even spicier. So we're gonna go down, back to the corner. Now we're gonna go back to design mode, and we're going to add one more fill to our rectangle. This one's gonna be on the top, change it to solid. And I believe we're going to use our bright color for this. So let's go to our text, grab our bright color, back to our rectangle, and add it in. That looks terrible. Correct. It does look terrible. But the point of this is to only show up in the animation, so let's set the opacity to 0. Now let's go back to animate mode, and we're going to add one more timeline, and we're just going to call this one glow. Put it at the bottom. So what's going to happen here is we're just going to keyframe in first the opacity. So for this glow effect, we want it to kind of, it's going to turn on and then it's going to turn off. And again, we could do this multiple different ways. I could set up a state machine here that did what we just did and go play it in one direction and then reverse it or whatever. But because there's hardly anything going on here, I'm actually going to do it more of a traditional way where we're going to keyframe in and then we're going to just fade it in and fade it back out again. So we're going to have 3 keyframes set up. It's going to start at 0%. Then it's going to get to, I don't know, 50%, 60%, whatever you really want here. And then it's going to go back down to 0% again. So you can't see it. So if I change this to 50, obviously this is just going to blip like that. Okay. Now what are we doing with this? Let's make it look cool. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to feather it. And it's going to be an outer feather. And to really make this cool and pop, what you want to do is you want to change the blend mode. Now, let's try it on overlay to start, but we might switch to color dodge depending. You can try all of these if you really want to. It's totally up to you. This is just a fun little extra effect. So let's start it with a feathering amount of 12, maybe the unit is pixels for feathering, I don't know. So when we get to here, when we get to the middle part, That's when it should show up a little bit more. And then at the end, what I want this one to do is the feathering should expand from the beginning all the way to the end. The opacity is making it invisible at the end, but the feathering effect should play throughout the entire timeline. So let's change this to 50 at the end. So we're going from 12 to 50. So let's just slowly scrub through this and see if we can actually see it. And it doesn't really look like it. This is why I like to play with the blend modes. So let's go back to design and let's change this to color dodge and see what we get. Okay, see, I like this more because it's actually highlighting the background behind it as well. So I think we could even add more feathering to this to make it pop even more. So let's change this to 75 at the end and see how that affects it. Yeah, that's not bad. And then of course we can change how bright we want it too. So if we changed in the middle to this to be 75, obviously it's a lot brighter. You know, you could make it not as bright as well, depending on if you want this effect to be subtle or not. And of course you can change the color as well. Ooh, I actually like that. That's cool. Let's do that. So all we're doing with this timeline is it's going to be its own layer because this is going to run in one direction every time you press the button. So all we have to do is create another layer, call it, just call it glow. And then we're going to drag the glow timeline on and we're going to add the condition for this to press as well. So again, when the button is pressed, trigger this animation and then exit. Now we're probably going to have to change the duration of this as well, but let's test it. Okay, pops in. And we press. Okay, so it's not actually playing it because we haven't set the duration. So let's change this exit duration to 100%. There you go. So now when you press it, it gives you a little bit more visual feedback and kind of glows out, which is nice. Okay, so that's really it for this holographic button. If you liked it, if you like this tutorial, great. You know, give it a like, thumbs up, whatever. I'm trying to do some Rive tutorials here and there as I go about using Rive in my day-to-day. So if you like this, great, stick around. Hopefully I can release some more. If you have any questions, just send me a message. Follow me on Twitter. I post all kinds of stuff like this. Craig M. Sartor. So yeah, hopefully you like this one. I'll share it on the community. Link will be in the description. And have a great one.